That's what you get for trying to be helpful. One man used to go to bed dreaming of nectar and awaken with it still on his mind. Then one morning it stopped. To a real warrior, death is the easy way out. In the game that men mentally take life to be, all problems and inequities perceived in the game are a natural indigenous part of the game. One man sometimes lived up in the mountains by himself and sometimes down in town with everyone else. One man sometimes lived up in the mountains by himself and sometimes down in the town with everyone else. One man sometimes lived up in the mountains by himself and sometimes down in town with everyone else. One man began to understand that when, down in town, he was everyone else. Those who publicly distinguish themselves are quite undistinguished. What kind of hermit posts signs pointing to his refuge? And what manner of ungainly thought attempts to pat itself on the back while lacking arms? In one castle there was a knight who kept charging off and another who kept riding back. All directions go in two directions, except that singular path. In the cell occupied by only himself, one man posted a sign that said, "Get lost," which was just another one he had hung last year, which read, "Get found." Continuing cliche cleanup time. History that can be rewritten was not history, but man's model thereof. And the question arises, is the past really as rigid as men think, or is it the rigidity of their thinking that makes it seem so? A reality of mere 4 dimensions lacks sufficient oxygen to support individual life. Only collective man, with his fixed model personality, can survive in but a model of reality. The mystic knight must always, right away, forever on the move, deserting all that is stable, established, secure, and which has a history upon which the collective can depend. There are 2 kinds of myths, those for children and infantile minds, and others for those of matured understanding. They're both, of course, the same, just as with the everyday thoughts men have. When they crack open myths and legends, the alert discover hidden treats. Same as smashing all models reveals the building plans therein. 'Twas secretly the gods themselves who first told men tales, admonishing them not to assault the deities. Thought, if nothing else, is vigorously self-defensive. Now watch it. The normally unrecognized equitable distribution of all energy is such that those of simple mind are the very ones who can never see how simple it all is. At the collective level, life gradually makes the simple more complex, while at the individual level, you must do it for yourself. One guy told himself, "You talk a good game," which for many years satisfied him. The distinction between thought-based thought and thought-based action can be pictured as the difference between models of reality and a direct confrontation therewith. And yet, it can still seem a dab unfair in that while satisfaction of action can bring peace of thought, no readily apparent action of thought produces a like result for itself. Thus it came to be that knights not content with the view from atop a 4-legged steed discovered the need to escape to a whole new world. At an early stage in his life, one man thought, "I can't stand to be this dumb." Then later thought, "'Tis grand to be this smart." And soon after, How can I bear the stupidity of others? And then, miracle of unexpected miracles, he began to actually calm down and understand what was going on. So much shortcakes for tonight's little fairy tale. One man studied an area that intrigued him for so long that he gained a noticeable efficiency therein, but then, for some reason, lost interest in it. And the question was put forward, is this by any chance referring to simply being alive? Look, if you got to ask, don't ask. How at one level things must work as they do for them to work at that level. In the original blues song competition, one guy was cut out in the first round with his tune entitled, "Oh Lord, Why Am I Treated So Decently?" Outside the arena, he was later heard to mutter that, contrary to his treatment, that he should in fact have been awarded first prize due to the additional difficulties he had had to overcome in this particular endeavor as reflected in his song title. The common man is most attracted to the visible world out there, and the philosopher to the unseen one within. So where does the mystic fit in this scheme of things? Well, he doesn't, you silly boob. There was once a warrior who had clothes that didn't fit him. Yet better than that, he had a secret hem that no manner of clothes would fit. No consciousness not too big for its mental britches deserves to be called consciousness. Now do it. A mirror maker's son cleaned up a certain cliche by musing, "No reflection is 1,000 or even a dozen words worth." The great two-dimensional beast of the neural underworld feeds on the agitation of mental irritation. And one kingdom expressed its displeasure with the criticism of its religious role models by exclaiming, "How dare they try to feed little Richard to the lions? For there is no rock without roll, no rhythm without blues, no hip without hop, and no me without you. At least, when by me you attempt to pattern yourself." The inspiration for the first tale of Beauty and the Beast was the consumption of peacocks by jackals with their carcasses ultimately feeding orchids. The original title, by the way, was Beauty and the Beast and Beauty. Alas, however, for those who do not choke on two words, those who do not choke on two words will do no better on three. Another way that life non-sexually propagates itself through man. Everyone wants their hero to become. There was once a place where thought was recognized as the prototype for all heroic notions. Otherwise known as the neural seduction. Come, my darling, let me convince you and win you over, so that our composite issue will assure our genetic survival. Within such a set structure, can the extraordinary message of the mystical grail ever be communicated? Is it each knight's individual charge to suitably seduce himself, so as to guarantee his own mutant expansion extraneous this framework? One man had an imaginary friend who went with him everywhere, and sometimes he was more aware of his companion's presence than at others. But regardless of that, the friend was always with him. In one city of skyscrapers, the upper stories flashed continual lights. They flashed, and then they flashed some more. But scant illumination was produced. Simply having electricity is no guarantee that you'll have working appliances. In one half of one universe was the machinery that produced all of the statements that told the creatures what they were not and what they could not do. and then the other half was turned out all of the pronouncements affirming precisely what they were and fully detailing their potential. In that distant universe, not unlike the one at hand, most of the beings seemed unable to hear half of what was said. While the simple can speak in simple terms, only the complex can think in them. When alone, one man was a giant, and in a crowd, a pygmy. One neural adventurer would, half of the time in his inner exploits, make use of this process in reverse. One man's personal directive to himself regarding the cars he would find lined up ahead of him was, "Don't honk, pull around them." One man studied mathematics for 10 years, then physics for 10, then followed that with philosophy for 10, and then another 10 in history, and finally wondered, what will I do now? The collective's answer is, repeat as necessary. And, of course, for the few, there is no answer. A man on drugs can't tell if everyone else is or not. To the physician, he said, "I don't want to suffer needlessly," which was an unnecessary and useless comment inasmuch as it was obvious that he was alive. Few students know what it is to be studied, and none of those are in the classroom. A certain warrior was one day confronted by the apparition of mortally conceived of Fate, who inquired of him, "How would you like for me to kill you?" And he replied, "What you may or may not do is of no interest to me." And the hybrid illusion made leave. In response to their questions regarding his lack of aggressive correction, the master of one school said to the students, "It's not my job to pick on you. That's your responsibility." After saying this, he paused for several seconds or years, then continued. And those of you who finally realize what this is all about will discover that it's not your obligation either. Question: should an alert man find it more important to have a sentence that sounds good and which more or less says what he wanted to, or have one that isn't so impressive but which nails down flat what he intended to convey? 'Tis the less civilized and the less intellectual among the civilized who see civilization as a downward turn for man. What can you say about a species whose favorite snack is a bite out of themselves? Even though the body can live for 80 years, many hormones die at 40, and most minds before that. Good King Arthur looked out upon the nightly neurons and proclaimed, "You guys sure better watch it." City poets will write about anything rather than have to leave their stool. Health news, completely off the scale. Is can't be repaired, nor genes be treated by genes. City specialists will speculate on anything rather than face the facts. Once the noise stops, the music stops. And a man can realize that the music has been all noise. The distinction between ordinary thinking and the expanded variety is that the former can make no useful distinctions. Where the many see the cars, the few see traffic. And where the many see traffic, the few see the cars. Same as when it looks, the mind sees itself, while consciousness sees it as its own operations. One knight began to suspect that the Grail was actually hidden right there in the castle. And when he revealed this suspicion to Merlin, the wise one replied, "So where have you been?" There was once a kingdom wherein was not permitted any myth, metaphor, or fable that would tend to upset the common man. And to help minimize such possibilities, thus was capital R religion born. To his counselor, one man confided, I do not wish to be needlessly disturbed. And the comforter of the collective replied, and there is no need to be. Simply do not think about it, and all will be well. The fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not a vexation to the binaries as long as they're not aware of it. Health, at one level, can be diagnosed as ignorance. Time for alternative interpretation. If the mind is the castle and thoughts the knights, then what is it they ride off on? Time for alternative analyzation. Only non-local understanding can make alternative interpretations, which also is why allegories have such a short shelf life and ill history of successful travel as to have almost no shelf life at all and scarce capacity for any transition. While a knight is always off on a roam, a miss should stay back at home. One man stayed indoors way too much. And let everyone who still finds intersystemic self-contradictions in all of this raise your hands and continue counting off 5 billion and 2. Man has 2 sides to his brain so that he won't tip over. Same as why all his models of reality have 4 dimensions so they'll stay in balance. Do also note that city specialists are always careful to take careful note of all possible exceptions to everything. The trains adopted for use by man have no destination. Thus, complaints regarding interminable travel are without merit. A mind that cannot run in reverse cannot be said to truly run. Although they can naturally handle the matter quite adequately, those who take walking lessons say later that their ambulatory abilities have noticeably improved. Some similar take could be took of most mystical activities. Life partly hides its secret by making those most publicly interested therein seem to be deadly serious. And I mean serious, and I mean deadly. Yeah. Long ago, right in the beginning, life said, let's play a game. I'll pretend to hide, and you pretend to try and find me. And what choice did puny little man have but to play? Oh, conductor, conductor. Yeah, I know, you want to get off. Save it. One day in a mood of play, pretending to be the podiatrist, life told man, the corns can stay, but those feet got to go. There is but one model tolerable to a true warrior, and that be one constructed by he alone. City thinkers believe that common men are led around by their sexual gonads, while oblivious that they are led around by the gonads of their mind. Moral: an upside-down tree climber can look in his own pants and see only sky. From the neck down, one man was happy, but from the neck up, he couldn't accept it. The kingdom of common man. You got to love it. At least if you continue living there. Of those, the blatant victims of justice cry out. Only those, the blatant victims of justice, cry out, injustice. There was once a gamesman warrior who became greatly disturbed to find that his checkbook was in balance. And in retaliation, he placed his balance book in check. All roads run in 2 directions, save the one rode by knights in their mind. To the few interested in this kind of stuff, perhaps the most dastardly aspect of life on this planet is that there is nothing natural in man's thinking that says anything about this kind of stuff. Okay, I will. For the few people interested in this kind of stuff, perhaps the most dastardly aspect of life on this planet is that there is nothing, yes, nothing, natural in his thinking, yes, nothing, natural in his thinking that speaks of this kind of stuff. Now, this is not bad news. It's not in the same category as bad news. It's distinctly different, because bad news is news that you can't do anything about. While this should be, to the few interested in it, more in the category of HJI, hopefully jarring info. Because if you got the first part, and then me pointing out that that was not bad news, it is yet of use that I was going to try and make you consider tonight, that it's not a matter of bad news, which you cannot do anything about, but it's a matter of being able to see the extreme difficulty in doing this kind of stuff, and then use that as a reminder to do it. I'm not going to start all over and make it make any more sense. It should be just as clear as hell. Which I know it is. As clear as hell to everything else you think, and about the same relationship that, let us say that you backed off 300 miles from planet Earth, and you look down and you can see the full planet. The clarity of my opening comments to everything else you think about would have the same sort of relationship as observing the planet from 300 miles out, and the number of polka-dotted bow ties you would pick up in your vision. The intent to be convey a very lopsided ratio, an almost infinitesimal amount of clarity taking up a man's thinking, even those people interested in such as this, compared to everything else he thinks. As I'm sure everyone is aware, publicly known religious literature, lesser known so-called mystical writings and legends have it. Well, let's take the easy one. In religion, being a very weak reflection of this sort of activity, you might say, for the sake of this, that it's commonly known of men torturing themselves physically, at least making themselves uncomfortable, everything from the hair shirt to the actual torture of climbing, ascending thousands of rough-hewn steps up to a cathedral while crawling on one's stomach, slashing one's wrist, driving nails in one's palms, trying to recreate the crucifixion, and such as that. And those that are somewhere less than extreme self-mutilation have been described by its proponents as being for the sake to remind them of, and then they have different versions, but it's all the same thing, but they'll say it, that they will undertake to give up sex, to live a life of chastity, or that they will give up all meat, or they will give up alcohol, or they will go to a monastery and give up human companionship, or they will in fact wear a hair shirt, they will give away all their possessions every time they get something. They will do something that is physically uncomfortable. Their explanation for this being that they want to remind themselves of the mercy of God. They want to remind themselves of the all-encompassing love of Allah. They want to remind themselves that the duty of man should be to seek the face of the Creator. once you understand it, it's all the same thing. It's the attempt to do this sort of thing. It's the attempt for a man to bring his consciousness into some new state. And since it is when you're operating at the level of a all-encompassing board game, that is, all that which is natural to man's thinking. At that level, there is no extra systemic or extra game descriptions possible, which is why man, among other things, came up with the notion of gods. And you might also notice how weak they are, not to pick on it, but why from an ordinary level. At first you would think that God, if you had any understanding at an ordinary level, any tolerance, any respect for religion, and you wouldn't have to be religious, but if you had any sort of intellectual, semi-clinical view of it, you would think, well, man's idea of a super of the Creator, you would think, well, that has got to be, at least on paper, in words, has got to be the mightiest of descriptions. You would just give men credit, even if you had no particular belief in religion. You understand that you would think, well, the whole notion of gods have got to be the most striking, have got to be the most powerful of all possible human descriptions. And they're not, which is why men have to fight and kill each other and cry and whine and constantly defend their God, because some outsider can walk in. A 12-year-old snotty-nosed kid can walk up to a foreign religion, can walk up to the Pope if the kid was a Muslim, and say, what kind of God do you worship? And as soon as the Pope described it, little kids could go, ha, and make some old comment about, what a cheap-ass God that sounds like. And the Pope would immediately have to stop everything, using all this metaphorically. The point is that there is no, even though it would seem on the surface, that man's attempted descriptions of the gods would be the supreme, would be the height, the highest, sweetest, most poignant fruit on the verbal tree of humanity. That a man can describe the beautiful curve of a woman's breast or her hip, or a lovely meal, the aroma of his mother's cooking as he was, all of that. Poets can wax and make people apparently read it even thousands of years later and feel a tear in their eye. So compared to that, you would think, well, those who are interested in such things, which most of humanity has always been, collectively speaking, in the gods, then whatever descriptions men come up with to describe the gods, their power, their glory, their majesty, has got to be, it's got to be about as high as man can aspire to verbally or even intellectually. And it is not. I won't say it's any less, but it is certainly not any better, as witnessed by the fact that men must continually defend their gods in the same way they must defend their new clothes. They must defend their taste in music. Boy, have you heard the Foo Fighters? Have you heard such and such new group? Somebody, yeah, I heard them. God, they suck. You like them? Then you got to stand up for it. How do you like this new shirt? Well, that ain't bad. Keep wearing it. Maybe someday it'll come back in style. Maybe you'll die and come back as a mannequin in a dump yard or something. And a man gets very defensive, which is, even amongst ordinary psychologically inclined minds, is fairly easy to explain. Well, people can see it momentarily, that you can at least make them say, if you use somebody else for an example, don't use them, of course, but if you use other people and say, have you ever noticed if you pick on somebody's clothes, or if you pick on a guy's girlfriend, his new girlfriend, you go, God, what do you see in her? That he'll become super defensive. Or you pick on his favorite football team, and you say, and he swears that he loves that girl, that it's the love affair of his life, but you're talking to this other person, you say, but doesn't it strike you that something's a little, that a man that he is so vigorous, so passionate in his defense of her? Well, if he loved her so unconditionally as he claims to, then why does every time that he shows up with her, if one of us just kind of looks at her cockeyed, he just goes into fits? And another person, as long as you're not talking about them, they will go, yeah, because something does smell, even to ordinary minds, momentarily. That if you point out that how passionately a man defends something that he says, in essence, needs no defense, that his heart, his true passion, all of his mind, all of his interest is thereto given, And yet all you got to do is kind of look at it, whatever it is, and go, really? And he goes, oh, wait a minute, Mike. People go, yeah. They don't know what to make of it, and they can't keep it in mind, and they certainly can't apply it to themselves. But all I wanted you to see was, even that being a usable verbal or intellectual currency, if you then told people, that same kind of guy, you said, well, wait a minute, hold that thought for a second. Surely there'd be some exception to this, or a higher level, something that would begin to show some signs of immunity to this sort of dynamic. And the person might go, well, and you go, well, how about men's idea of gods? I mean, we're talking about the highest possible force, the highest possible imagined energy, the highest thing that the human mind can imagine, our own creator. Now that, whatever descriptions man come up with, that men have come up with, this has got to be the crowning glory, the supreme achievement of the human mind to come up with descriptions, to describe what their God is, what his characteristics are. And the person would have to go, well, yeah. You go, all right, now hold it, what we're talking about. Isn't it something funny that they at least as vigorously will defend in just a reflexive manner any assumed slight, any proposed or imagined assault upon the sanctity of their gods, that they will defend that with the same kind of vigor they do this girlfriend that he feels like is being insulted? And men just draw a blank. But you hear what I'm saying. The point of all that wasn't even on the main course of tonight's menu, but it had to do with the fact that no matter how hard the mind tries, no matter how sincere it claims to be, when you're playing, as I was describing, on one level, life, as men mentally perceive it to be, is a game. Even though they don't say it, and I don't use game in any pejorative sense. It is just to them a game without them knowing it, because of the fact, again without them knowing it, because of the fact that this game, nothing can change. You cannot get out of the game other than die, but we're talking about from the mental level. You cannot get out of the game, you cannot change the game in no way that makes the game tolerable. No way that makes men believe that the game has some life to it is that you can move the pieces around. But you cannot get anywhere. Well, they imagine they can, because there on the board they draw a line over here and say, all right, everybody can get over there, got somewhere, and so everybody works to get over there. So you get over there, and you think, well, now, well, hell, what? And you or somebody has to go, hey, something new. 30 degrees northeast, there's a new line. New line. Everybody go, all right, go for it. But the reason there's nothing extraordinary, what I was trying to get you to see, even in the areas that you would think at first had to have all of the possible evidence of something extraordinary possible for man's mind, would be in his descriptions of supernatural powers of gods. And the descriptions are as mundane, they are as board-laden as any other description, which is why he must defend it, because it does not rise above the board. It does not rise above an ordinary level of thinking. A man cannot, in his mind, imagine anything greater than him trying to imagine something greater. Even should it have feet, a man's mind cannot stand on its own shoulders. How about that? All right, what if it had centipede feet? It still cannot stand on its own shoulders. Back to where we were. Men have attempted to shake themselves out of a certain kind of ill-perceived state of lethargy. Now, in the religious context, which is where it's best known, and I was springing us there from to start with, they do not look at it as being a form of lethargy. They look at it as being a form of sin, some shortcoming. And so they attempt, or the effort, to wear a hair shirt, to put a stone in one's shoe, to go without some food that one enjoys. They would say at that level is to remind them of the several examples I gave you, of the mercy of God, the need for men to pursue the face of the Creator, and etc. But all they're saying is one thing. once you get it past that illusionary game level. The kind of transcendental reality behind that, or deeper behind that, is that they're trying to do the same thing that any mystic worth, even having a small limb sewn into his underwear by his mama, knows that there is nothing. There is no such thing as a state of enlightenment. There is no liberation of the mind. There is no higher state of consciousness without first being able to do something with this goddamn running thinking process. Nothing. Of course, very few people know that. In fact, we can keep the count going of those who don't. What are we up to? 5 billion and 3, 5 billion and 4. Go ahead and keep it up. Just hold down the counting. Do it to yourselves. But that's all it amounts to, which is kind of funny to put it that way, which is all it amounts to. But if you can see the difference between bad news and my, what was it, HJI, hopefully jarring info, you can use the latter. Bad news is just bad news. It's just ordinary human minds going, uh-oh, I lost a turn, I had to go to jail. Uh-oh, somebody landed on boardwalk when I didn't have any hotels, or uh-oh, they're going to mortgage my park place or foreclose on it. Uh-oh, I've been checkmated. That's all bad news. Hey, your father just died. I mean, that's serious bad news. Who the hell wants to hear it? Hey, you just lost all your money. That wasn't the main subject, but I thought maybe somebody would appreciate me at least clearing that up finally after years of kicking around news and pointing out, asking you to consider why is all news, or the only news worth reporting and being repeated is bad news. And there's no psychological, well, there is for children. There's some sociological explanation. It has to do with the laws of physics, the kind of laws of physics that are not visible in a four-dimensional reality or model thereof. But bad news is simply one thing. It's something you can't do anything about. Of course, if it's good news, you don't have to worry about where it applies, because if it's good news, you don't do anything about it anyway. But all bad news is something you can't do anything about. Hey, somebody just hit your car. Well, why tell me? What good's that going to do? Hey, all of your hair is falling out behind where you can't see it. Well, hey, why tell me? Hey, from the rear, you look like hell. It's bad enough you got to deal with your front. Well, that's somebody. But the reason I was bringing up such as this tonight, and to try to get you to see that it can be of use. In fact, it can be of potential highest. Well, I'll leave that for you to decide, but it can be of extremely, potentially high octane use. Because all the ordinary ways that men have attempted to bring their attention, to bring something to their continuing attention, such as putting a rock in their shoe, all of that is based upon physical discomfort. All of it. All of it. Even when it appears in religious context and publicly known so-called mystical systems, even when it apparently begins to infringe into the area that is not totally physical, such as chanting or praying, which all still had the same intent, it is always on the basis of pursuing such as this to the point of physical discomfort. In other words, no religion, no mystical system says, well, we pray to such and such God or such and such guru or such and such muse, and here's the prayer. And you look down and you go, all right, I got that. You know, it's 4 or 5 lines or 10 lines. You go out and you say, no, I don't know. All right, I got it. And you say, well, I did it. Even while we were talking. After you left the room, left me with a card, I did it. Now what? And they go, oh, no. No. We're not talking about just do it. We're talking about do it forever. And of course, no one can do it. No one even puts any good effort to doing it. But they're already struck with the fact that of the physical discomfort should they attempt to do it. And if they did seclude themselves off like a band of monks, like-minded people by themselves, and devoted themselves to praying 12 hours a day. All it is to them is 12 hours of physical discomfort, which in some way is bad news, and which in some way they interpret to mean that they are making rightful supplications to the gods. And what else are they going to do? I'm suffering, God. Don't give me a break. I'm suffering more than I did from just being normal. I'm suffering more than I did before I joined this monastery, back when I was just ugly from the rear, my hair was falling out, and I couldn't get a date. I mean, I was suffering enough, Jesus. But now, to the goodness of my heart, through my devotion, through my desire to see thy face, to enter into thy presence, I have withdrawn from ordinary life, and I am now suffering more than I did out in life, but now I have done it by my own hand. Give me a break. Aren't you happy? Aren't you pleased with me? That's the general dynamics of all such as that. But at any rate, all of it is based upon creating physical discomfort. And here's what no one seems, or life does not seem inclined to let any ordinary people recognize. What they consider to be the problem at hand, what they define or describe as being their attempt, is of, they would call it, a spiritual nature. That is non-physical. They're attempting to enter into some closer relationship to the gods. So it is a non-physical thing. No religious person in the mainstream of life has ever said that they were expecting to actually fast, go without red meat on Friday for 2 or 3 years, and suddenly be transported into the seeing it physically with God somewhere. No one ever said that. No one considered to be ordinary. So they take it to be absolutely non-physical endeavor. But then no one seems to see anything at all curious, suspicious, over going about this through physical means. And the most extreme being, as I said, creating willfully, as it appeared, by your own hand, more physical discomfort than life normally hands out by just being alive and stumbling around for 80 years. But if it is indeed, as they put it, and they're correct, we don't use those terms, or it's sort of misleading, but a spiritual quest, a non-physical quest, then torturing oneself, no matter how small, physically, is going to do nothing. Carrying this holy rock, this pebble, that the Pope or a rabbi has blessed, or that some mystical guru has put his blessings on, and you put it in your shoe to help remind you to seek the manifest wisdom of creation. Carrying that shoe, that holy, blessed pebble around your shoe will do one thing. It'll cut your feet up. It will not make you more spiritual. It will not bring you any increased enlightenment. But if you understand all that, then the question should be to any right-thinking would-be mystic is, well, what the hell can you do? And that's what I'm trying to trick you into getting a glimpse of right before the tape runs out. Oh, well, it's out now. Sorry. Back to the opening line, which could be a lifetime's worth of commentary, if not from me, from you to you as a reminder, and that is, if I may be so kind as to repeat myself, to the few people interested in such as this, now and as always, but the few people interested in activities such as this, perhaps the most dastardly aspect of being alive on this planet, being a human, is the fact that there is nothing natural to man's thinking. I'm using man, you understand, with a small m. I'm talking about everybody. To the thinking of man, there is nothing in there, naturally, that speaks of this. Doesn't anybody like that? Remember, it's not bad. Remember, it's not bad news, because there's something to be done with that. But what if that was just bad news, as I described it? Something that the bad news is that which you can't do anything about. Now, even if it was that, you got to admit, that would be the worst damn news in the world. I mean, that would be the ultimate in bad news to a few people. There's no way to, I'm not going to try to prove it any further. which it can't be conclusively shown. It's a matter of whether you begin to see it, and you may hear it right now in words, and I'll repeat it at least another time or two. But then you might note, if you're alert at all, that even if you hear it finally to yourself and go, huh, because you already heard the words, but if it suddenly clicks, how that could be used and what, just the whole ramifications and potential significance of the statement, and you go, huh, then the really alert should notice, huh, really meant something then, and it might be what, another 6 months before you suddenly, for some reason, remember it again. You go, huh, which of course is what we're talking about, but I don't want confusion. That's why I made it sound like an extraneous example. The human mind, all the way from the area of religion, the gods, from that all the way to people seriously suspicious of, with some understanding of, the reality behind all that. In other words, this kind of stuff. All of them in there would take exception, some more, some less, to my opening comment, the one I just repeated again. That is, that there is nothing natural in the thinking of man that speaks of this. The religious would say absolutely otherwise. They would say that that is the voice of God in each man that sparks his conscience. They would say that, in fact, it is the knowledge that a higher force, that higher potentials exist. They would equate, many of them, with the absolute spark of life itself, that is what vitalizes man. They would say that man did not invent the idea of God, that in some way it is born into man. You understand that those kind of religious people, and I'm not speaking about anybody outside the mainstream of life, no fanatics, but just the ordinary people who find that they have some real interest in religion. They would absolutely deny what I said. They would be the most strong naysayers of my comment, that there is nothing natural in the thinking of man that addresses this, that speaks of it. They would say, contrary to the very fact that men think of God, the very fact that men try and reach a higher spiritual state, that men try to do better, they would offer as absolute proof of the error of my comment. Those you might think with a bit wider view of the matter, that is, would be mystics, those that may have greater, let us say, relative understanding of what's going on in life than would be the merely religious, they would also, perhaps with a little less passion and a little less certainty, but they would also take exception to my comment. For one thing, they would say, well, how did I even ever hear about this? How did I ever even stumble upon Sufism or Zen or some obscure cult somewhere? Or how would I have ever even stumbled upon or discovered what is supposedly esoteric cores of many religions? How do you explain that? There was something already in me. And they would also want to say, and I keep saying they, all you got to do is consider your own thinking, that they would want to say that, and they could start naming books. They could start naming chapters and verses in books, in particular books, wherein my comment was absolutely laid waste. That they would say that there have been things that spoke to me from life directly having to do with this. Things that, well, almost changed my life. I am, of course, being charitable because many of them would say things that changed my life. But they would say that there are things that have had an extraordinary impact on me. Things that I would have never heard in the main marketplace of life. Things that I only heard through some obscure writing. Something outside the mainstream of human literature and history. Can't prove it, and I am going to try, but my opening comment, and I'll do it again, is the correct one. It is the valid, it is the genuine comment and description of it. For those interested in such as this, and I'm really inferring those with some real interest, whatever that is, some lasting interest. They're wired up, that they cannot really shed themselves off said interest. Those interested in such as this perhaps would consider, once they see it, you've got to see it over some continual length of time until it becomes a part of your continuing understanding. But those interested in such as this would perhaps see as the most dastardly aspect of being alive on this planet the fact that there is nothing natural in man's thinking that speaks of this. It would also appear to be literally an oxymoronical statement, a conundrum, or a self-contradictory sentence. And it is. But it's not bad news. And it's not to point out, as I have not slacken to do in the past, that to do this kind of thing is down near impossible, but not for any sort of physical reason, not as it's normally assumed, and not because of any weakness in the moral fiber of man, and not through some continuing punishment inflicted by the gods for our forefathers' original sin. There's nothing near that exotic. It is nothing near that obscure. It is nothing full of that much bullshit. It is the fact that at the level of the game, that is the level at which the human mind conceives of itself in life, it can conceive of nothing higher. And it is not the fault of the mind, because the mind is the game. Any problem that the mind finds with the game, any inequities it finds with the game, any questions it has as to the game's sufficiency, for the game's reliance, for the game's veracity, they're misplacing it. They look at it as there's some sort of shortcomings or some kind of flaws in the game. And I'm not questioning that. That is, that they perceive them, because everyone's mind perceives them. But the perceived inequities and problems of the game, what they cannot perceive is that they are natural and indigenous to the game. I call them natural and indigenous, and when I wrote it, I did not go ahead and throw in, which almost seemed like overkill, but I'm going to do it now, absolutely inseparable, which of course is what natural and indigenous really means, but inseparable. That which the human mind, and I'm talking about ordinary, sane human minds, that which they conceive to be the problems, the difficulties of life. What it cannot perceive is what it cannot see is what these perceived problems are a natural, inseparable part of the game. That's not any sort of excuse for the so-called problems. That's not any kind of rationalization. That is a in-your-face statement of fact that the mind goes, huh? It is only the mind that calls certain aspects of the game to be problems, to be flaws, to be shortcomings. They are simply part of the game. It's not bad news, but a person, and I would suspect, I'll put this gently, sort of anecdotal, avuncular type terms, I would suspect that many a person must go many a year, many a decade, before it ever really strikes him in the face like a big old 10-pound wet mallet or mullet, to the face that it one day strikes you, like all good mystical information does, that, well, hell, I knew that. Yeah, you knew it, as I said, perhaps for many decades, and suddenly you realize, oh my God, now I'm stuck on it. Now I can't seem to get rid of it. That being the fact that there is nothing in the thinking process of life, in that great thinking cloud bank. And when I said in nothing, I mean in anybody's mind. There is nothing in anybody's mind from the world's most, from an Einstein to a street cleaner, from all the great artists to the man in the street. There is nothing, because it's all on the same level. There is nothing in there, never has been, in anything of the natural workings of the mind, there's nothing in there that actually speaks about this. Now, I know it seems to, because here I'm talking about it. And there are books that says the kind of things that men can't think about. There are books that say the great mysteries, the unexplainable mysteries of the world explained in 322 pages. I know all that. And so people say, well, how can you say that? It does address it. It does speak to it. It does not. If it did, in the same way that everything else in life, you usually buy this, a lot of you follow it when I point out that religion can't work, doesn't work. That is, it cannot fulfill its own self-stated claims and goals. It cannot achieve the goals. That's not my criticism. You ask them, what's the point of this? What's the point of psychiatry? What's the point of penal reform? What's the point of education? But religion and psychiatry are just prime examples. And you say, tell me your purpose. And I'm not adding anything to it. Take their purpose, and they can't achieve it. They're no closer than they were when they started. Men cannot see that. The mind certainly cannot see when you say that anything extraordinary, which this is, not physically, but is extraordinary in some non-visible way, and it's not extraordinary in a collective sense because it does not happen, it does not operate collectively, it only operates, if it does, individually. But you cannot tell the mind that this in any way is extraordinary and then tell it that in fact there's nothing in the mind, there's nothing that the mind has ever thought, any man's mind ever thought, collectively men have never thought, there's no thinking. I know there are words out there, but there's nothing in the natural process, the thinking processes of man that address this, that speak of it. And the mind, I mean, by then it's just, shut me off. Because it says, well, you're doing it right now. I know I'm yakking, but there's nothing in the ordinary thought process of the natural thought. And it's not this conspiracy, it's not that it's hidden, it's simply when you're operating at one level, that's the level of consciousness. If that is the mental game of life, all the information is from the same level. The pieces cannot get off the board. And if there is other information, and you're staying above a board and you're talking to somebody at that level, they don't hear it. It's non-existent. It is not bad news, though, because once, even if it takes you some matter of decades, to where that great greasy, sweaty flounder strikes you about the forehead, don't ask me who was holding it and who did it to you. I don't want to get into that kind of occult, weird shit. I want to stick to something valid and scientific. If you do see that there is nothing in the natural thought processes of man, of course, by then you quit looking out there. You have never thought anything that was actually about this. Now, I know you thought about this, but it wasn't actually speaking about this. Because if you can think about it, forget it. Now, rather than that be bad news, that, exemplifying, that being about the total verbal wrap-up of the situation, what better reminder could a man have? Boy, forget, not even pebbles in shoes. What if you tried to put a cement block down in your boot? You wore 2 hair shirts, hair underwear. That's nothing. If you could keep that kind of jarring info, you've got nowhere else to look. You don't need any specific reminders. You don't need any specific book. You don't need any specific thing to think about. You don't have to have a mantra. You don't have to have a secret word. All you've got, once you have it, if you do, is this understanding, this knowledge whenever you can retrieve it, whenever it seems to come back home, that anything that man thinks are put my way for the time being. I recommend that for your consideration, that there is nothing in the natural thinking of man. Now, I've covered it all. Nothing in the natural thinking of man. We're talking about anybody, anytime, anywhere. It's not there. It can't be there. There's nothing in the natural thinking of man that speaks of this. I started to say that will remind you of this. But let's say that speaks to this. Because then you use that fact to help remind you of the fact. What better reminder than the fact that it's almost impossible to do this, except that almost sounds like a form of nihilism. And it's not. But look how it narrows it down. Your own mind becomes the reminder. Humanity has spent and still spends their lives going out, giving up sex, giving up food, giving up comfort, giving up good health care, feet care, foot health, all kinds of stuff, in the attempt, no matter what they call it, but in the attempt to remind themselves that they're trying to do something outside the main flow of life. That's child's play. It's when you have the knowledge that the whole flow of life has nothing to do with this, nothing, that there's nothing in that that will help you, you got the world's greatest reminder. Because then, no matter where you look, there's the reminder. All you got to do, I'll admit, the one problem left is you got to remember, to think about that. But other than that, I recommend it to you highly.